George Michael lost two people to AIDS. The first was his partner, Anselmo Feleppa, in 1993. A Brazilian man George loved in secret because the world wasn't ready to know. The second was Freddie Mercury, not a partner, but a fellow artist who died 18 months earlier while the world watched and judged. That night, George made a decision that would define the next 23 years of his life. What he did in absolute silence. Nobody knew. Nobody suspected. Until December 25, 2016, when George died and the truth finally came out. This is the story the world wasn't supposed to know. Before I share this incredible story with you, if you want to discover the most touching and powerful untold stories from music history, real accounts of courage, sacrifice, and humanity from the legends who shaped our culture, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because the story I'm going to tell you today isn't just about a pop star. It's about love, loss, and a 23-year fight against a disease that was killing thousands while society looked away. The 1980s were a terrifying time to be gay. AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, had emerged in 1981, and by 1985, it was killing thousands of people every year, almost exclusively gay men in the Western world. The disease was poorly understood. There was no treatment, no cure, just a slow, painful death that could take months or years. But worse than the disease itself was the stigma. Society called it the gay plague. Politicians ignored it. Religious leaders called it divine punishment. Hospitals turned patients away. Families abandoned their dying sons. And the entertainment industry, Hollywood, music, television, stayed silent because being associated with AIDS meant being associated with homosexuality, and that could destroy careers. George Michael was living this reality in secret. He'd known he was gay since his teenage years, but he'd never come out publicly. In the 1980s, that would have been career suicide. George was part of Wham, one of the biggest pop acts in the world. Teenage girls screamed his name. His image was built on being a heartthrob, a straight romantic idol. Coming out wasn't just scary, it felt impossible. So George lived two lives. Public George, the pop star. Private George, the gay man hiding in plain sight, terrified of being discovered. Then, in 1991, everything changed. On November 24th, Freddie Mercury died. George had met Freddie a few times. They weren't close friends, but they respected each other as artists. Freddie had announced he had AIDS just 24 hours before his death. For years, he'd hidden it, terrified of the stigma. When he finally told the world, he had hours left to live. George watched the news coverage of Freddie's death and felt something break inside him. Freddie had been forced to live in silence, die in silence, and only speak his truth when it was too late. George didn't want that to be his story, but he also wasn't ready to come out. Not yet. The world was still too cruel. Then George met Anselmo Feleppa. Anselmo was a Brazilian fashion designer. Handsome, warm, funny. George met him at a concert in Rio de Janeiro in 1991, just weeks after Freddie's death. They fell in love. Not the public, performative love George had faked with women for cameras. Real love, the kind that makes you want to build a life with someone. But they couldn't, because Anselmo was HIV positive. HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, was the virus that caused AIDS. In 1991, an HIV diagnosis was essentially a death sentence. There were experimental drugs, but they were expensive, often ineffective, and came with brutal side effects. Anselmo had been infected years earlier, before he met George. He'd been managing it quietly, but by 1992, his health was declining. The virus was progressing to full-blown AIDS. George did everything he could. He flew Anselmo to the best doctors in London. He paid for experimental treatments. He spent every moment he could by Anselmo's side. But they had to hide. If the press found out George was dating a man, especially a man dying of AIDS, it would destroy everything. George's career, his family's privacy, even Anselmo's dignity. So George visited hospitals in disguise, wore baseball caps and sunglasses, stood in hallways instead of sitting by Anselmo's bed, watched the man he loved die slowly, painfully, while pretending to the world that he barely knew him. Anselmo Feleppa died on March 26, 1993. He was 36 years old. George was devastated. He couldn't grieve publicly, couldn't tell anyone what Anselmo had meant to him, couldn't even attend the funeral without risking exposure. So he grieved alone. And in that grief, he wrote a song. Jesus to a Child was released in 1996. The world assumed it was a religious song, a spiritual meditation. But it wasn't. It was George's funeral hymn for Anselmo. Every line was about loss, about loving someone the world wouldn't let you love, about watching someone die and not being able to hold their hand. The song went to #1 in the UK. Millions of people sang along, never knowing they were singing about a secret love, a hidden death, a grief George couldn't share. But the song wasn't enough. George needed to do something more. Something Freddie hadn't been able to do because he'd run out of time. George decided he would fight AIDS. Not publicly. He still wasn't ready to come out, still wasn't ready to face the hatred and judgment. But privately, silently, in ways nobody would know about until he was gone. In 1993, shortly after Anselmo's death, the Terence Higgins Trust, Britain's leading AIDS charity, received an anonymous donation. £1 million. No name, no contact information, just a note that said, "In memory." The charity was stunned. £1 million donations didn't just appear from nowhere. They tried to trace the donor, but couldn't. 6 months later, another £1 million arrived. Same anonymity, same simple note. This continued for 23 years. Every few months, sometimes twice a year, anonymous donations ranging from £500,000 to £2 million would arrive at the Terence Higgins Trust. By 2016, the total exceeded £15 million. The charity suspected who it might be. There were only so many people in Britain with that kind of wealth and connection to the AIDS crisis. But they never confirmed it, never publicized it, because the donor clearly didn't want recognition. That donor was George Michael, and the donations were just the beginning. Starting in 1993, George began making secret visits to AIDS wards in London hospitals. He'd arrive late at night, after visiting hours, wearing a disguise. No cameras, no press, no announcement. He'd sit with patients nobody else wanted to visit. Men who'd been abandoned by their families. Men who were dying alone because society still saw AIDS as shameful, as punishment, as something to be hidden. George would hold their hands, listen to their stories. Sometimes he'd sing quietly if they asked. Most of the time, he'd just sit there, keeping them company, reminding them they weren't alone. Nurses who witnessed these visits were asked not to talk about them. George didn't want publicity. He didn't want credit. He just wanted to help. One nurse, Sarah Williams, later said in a 2017 interview, "He came every few weeks for years. Sometimes he'd stay for hours. He never made a big deal of it. Never acted like he was doing something heroic. He just treated those men like they mattered, like they were worth his time." In the 1990s, when most of the world wanted nothing to do with AIDS patients, George Michael sat with them and made them feel human again. George also funded research. Quietly, through anonymous grants and donations, he helped finance experimental drug trials that eventually led to breakthroughs in HIV treatment. By the late 1990s, new antiretroviral drugs were turning HIV from a death sentence into a manageable chronic condition. George's money had helped make that possible. But nobody knew. Nobody thanked him, because nobody knew he was the one funding it. In 1998, George's life changed again. He was arrested in a public restroom in Los Angeles for lewd conduct. It was a setup, an undercover police sting targeting gay men. George was outed to the world in the most humiliating way possible. The tabloids had a field day. His career took a hit. But something unexpected happened. George felt relieved. The secret was out. He didn't have to hide anymore. After 1998, George became more open about his sexuality. He gave interviews. He talked about the pain of living in the closet. He became an advocate for LGBTQ+ rights. But even then, he never talked about his AIDS activism. Never mentioned the donations. Never mentioned the hospital visits. Never told anyone about Anselmo. That part of his life stayed locked away. George continued his secret work for another 18 years. Hospital visits became less frequent as treatments improved, and the stigma slowly began to fade. But the donations continued. Every year, without fail, the Terence Higgins Trust received money from their anonymous benefactor. And every year, George Michael went about his public life, making music, doing interviews, living openly as a gay man, while keeping his most significant work completely hidden. On December 25, 2016, George Michael died at his home in Oxfordshire. He was 53 years old. The cause of death was dilated cardiomyopathy with myocarditis and a fatty liver. Natural causes, though likely exacerbated by years of stress, grief, and substance use. The world mourned. Tributes poured in from fans, fellow artists, and celebrities. Everyone remembered George as a brilliant musician, a gay icon, a complicated but beloved figure. But then the truth started coming out. In the weeks after George's death, his will was made public. It revealed donations totaling over £15 million to the Terence Higgins Trust over 23 years. The charity confirmed they'd been receiving anonymous donations since 1993 and had suspected George was the donor, but had respected his wish for privacy. Then nurses started speaking. Sarah Williams and others who'd witnessed George's secret hospital visits came forward. They shared stories of a man who'd spent years visiting dying AIDS patients in the middle of the night, asking for no recognition, just quietly being there for people society had abandoned. Then more stories emerged. A waitress came forward and said George had anonymously paid off her debt in the 1990s after overhearing her talk about struggling to pay for her student loans. A woman on a TV game show revealed that George had anonymously funded her IVF treatment after seeing her story. A couple at a cafe said George had secretly paid for a kitchen appliance they couldn't afford. Dozens of stories, hundreds of stories, acts of kindness, large and small, that George had done over decades without ever taking credit. But the AIDS activism hit differently, because that wasn't just charity. That was deeply personal. That was George fighting the disease that had killed Freddie Mercury and Anselmo Feleppa. That was George sitting with dying men and making them feel seen. That was George funding research that would eventually save countless lives. And he'd done it all in complete silence. Why did George keep it secret? In a 2004 interview, years before his death, George was asked about philanthropy. He said something revealing. "I don't believe in charity for publicity. If you're helping people because you want recognition, you're not really helping. You're using their suffering to make yourself look good. Real kindness is what you do when nobody's watching, when there's no reward except knowing you did the right thing." George lived that philosophy. He didn't fight AIDS publicly because he didn't want to be seen as a hero. He didn't want think pieces about George Michael, AIDS activist. He didn't want awards or recognition. He just wanted to help. He wanted to honor Freddie, who tried to speak out but ran out of time. He wanted to honor Anselmo, who died in shadows. And he wanted to make sure other people living with HIV, people dying of AIDS, people terrified and alone, knew that someone cared. Even if they never knew it was George Michael caring. Today, HIV is no longer a death sentence. Antiretroviral therapy allows people with HIV to live normal, healthy lives. The stigma, while still present, has diminished enormously. Gay men no longer live in constant terror of a disease that could kill them. And much of that progress happened because of people like George Michael. People who fought in silence, who donated millions, who funded research, who sat with dying patients and reminded them they mattered. George never got to see how much his work meant. He died before the full extent of his activism became public. But those who knew, the nurses, the doctors, the researchers, the patients who survived because of the treatments his money helped develop, they knew. They always knew someone was fighting for them, even if they didn't know who. The Terence Higgins Trust issued a statement after George's death. George Michael was one of the greatest supporters in our history. His generosity helped fund breakthrough research, provided care for countless patients, and saved lives. He asked for nothing in return except that we continue the fight. We will never forget what he did for the HIV and AIDS community. Elton John, another artist who'd lost friends to AIDS and became a vocal advocate, said, "George did more for AIDS research than most people will ever know. He did it quietly, humbly, and without asking for recognition." That's true heroism. Not the kind that gets you headlines, but the kind that actually changes lives. This story reminds us that the most important work often happens in silence. George Michael didn't need the world to know he was fighting AIDS. He just needed to fight. For Freddie, who died too soon. For Anselmo, who'd loved him and been loved in return, but never publicly acknowledged. For the thousands of men who'd died alone, stigmatized, forgotten. And for the future, a future where HIV wouldn't be a death sentence, where being gay wouldn't be shameful, where people could love openly without fear. George Michael gave us incredible music. Faith, Careless Whisper, Freedom, Jesus to a Child, songs that define generations. But his greatest legacy might be the one he never wanted us to know about. The 23 years he spent fighting a disease in the shadows. The millions of pounds he gave without recognition. The lives he touched, the research he funded, the dying patients he comforted when nobody else would. He did it in absolute silence. And perhaps that's exactly how he wanted it. Because George Michael understood something fundamental. Real kindness doesn't need an audience. Real courage doesn't need applause. And real love, whether for a partner, a friend, or humanity itself, doesn't need the world's permission to exist. On Christmas Day 2016, the world lost George Michael. But in losing him, we finally learned the truth of who he was. Not just a pop star, not just a gay icon, but a man who fought for others when it cost him everything. A man who loved deeply, grieved privately, and gave endlessly without asking for anything in return. A man who proved that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones whose heroism only becomes visible after they're gone.